Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. Okay, so if you know me, if you follow the show, you know that I spent a few of my years in the corporate space in the tech industry. And part of, what I was doing in that space was really trying to help increase the number of underrepresented technologists in this space. But when I got into doing the work, I found and discovered areas of technology that I didn't even know people were using or utilizing to help underserved populations. And so I really wanted to break that down today because I think it's so important that as we're talking about emerging technology and the technology that we have, how can we utilize it to make and create a more equitable world, right? And so today my guest is Skyra Rideaux, and she is a specialist in this space. And I'm so excited to have this conversation because when we were just first chatting, we just started to just bubble over with all of the possibilities. So Skyra, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I'm so excited to be here.
So, for anyone who may not know who you are, can you just give us a little bit of your background?
Absolutely. So I have a very non-linear career. I started in the military. So I served in the U.S. Navy for 7 years as a bomb builder. And then I'm a first generation college grad. So my undergrad is in public relations. And I had a number of different roles throughout my life, but probably around 2016 is when I really started getting into the space of environmental racism and climate justice work. So I was the first Black woman appointed to serve in the mayor president's office. And I just really kind of tripped and fell into that work. And that's really where I started doing work at the intersection of policy and people. And I realized that was the space that I really needed to be in. And then over time, I started adding in components of technology. So I really love this work. I think it liberates me. I do it because in real time, it liberates me. And I'm hoping that we can see equitable outcomes in my lifetime. I'm not doing it for future generations. I want it to happen now. And so I do DEI work, really equity and liberation work. At the intersection of technology and liberation. So it's been quite a journey. I love it. And no day looks like the next day. And that's the best part.
So what you said equity, liberty?
Liberation.
So explain what that is, because I think I have an understanding of what that is and how my mind works. But for those that are listening or watching, can you explain that? And what does that mean?
Yeah. So when you're talking about liberation theory, right, it's like a philosophical framework that emphasizes the liberation of oppressed groups. So what we typically think of as underrepresented groups. So Black, Indigenous, poor, or impoverished. I like to use impoverished better because you don't assign that to people. But it's really about political, social, and economic injustices that continue to be leveraged on these communities, right? And using that framework as the foundation to build equitable futures or to build equitable outcomes for people. And equity really is just an emphasis on ensuring that those who have been historically harmed, those who have been historically oppressed, get an overabundance of the resources that they weren't able to get previously, so that we get to a place of equity and then we can thrive from there. So it's really just a philosophical framework, right, that advocates for addressing issues in a manner that tackles social inequities.
One of the reasons why I love this conversation and talking about this is because I think there's so many things that are happening right now real time that people may or may not connect the dots on, right? So I say 2017, 2018, somewhere around there. When I was working in tech, the conversations we were having then around AI and machine learning, I worked in an area where there was concern that was voiced around like who our customers were in that space, right? A lot of police departments were using that technology to canvas particular communities, right? And using that data to kind of populate the database. And
Yep.
so, of course, we know that there's bias in the data, and there are certain communities that were going to be overpopulated. Populated. That's the word I'm looking for. Oh, there's a word out there. That were going to be populated in there more so than others, which just kind of added to the bias and how AI works. We all kind of know now. And it was just fascinating to me because at the same time, we were working with organizations that were trying to get, AI and machine learning into some of these same communities. And I'm like, I wonder what it would look like if you all were able to program, right, this AI to police the police.
Listen, so
right?
that's what we really should be using it for. Unfortunately, that's not. They're using currently like AI and machine learning for predictive modeling as a new way to profile.
Mm-hmm.
With the broken window theory that we kind of know that came out of New York a few years ago. But basically, the idea, or what I am hoping that we can get to a place of when we're talking about technology, is kind of, Peter Bloom said this. He's a founder of like Rhizomatica, and he was like, I want to help communities define their technological futures instead of just adapting to technology that arrives there, right? So how do we put this technology in the hands of the people, as opposed to saying this technology exists and someone else is going to leverage it to further harm them?
Yeah.
That's this place I think we can get to.
Yeah. And that's, one of the areas where I was just so concerned about. And again, working in those type of organizations, they're not necessarily thinking of justice. It's really about who can we sell the most of these things to.
Money.
Right?
It's capitalism, right? Every day.
Yeah. And so, it was frustrating for me because I'm like, some of these very same talented individuals that we're finding in these communities could program this camera to not look for crime, but look for other things that are impacting the community that are meaningful to them, where the police don't even have to get involved. And so I started having some of those conversations with organizations like in California and other parts of the country. And it just never, again, we're talking 2017, 2018, right? Before people were really thinking about AI and machine learning. And it never really picked up. And so now that everybody and their mama has access to AI, now I'm starting to hear a little bit more of those conversations. But that's not the only thing that's out there, right? Wearable technology has been around for decades. How can, people, can you give us an example of like how people can use wearable technology in this instance?
So there are so many different ways, and the global grouping of it is called emerging tech. So there's so many different components of emerging tech that exist, right? But Internet of Things or wearable tech is kind of what you're talking about and where it falls.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some examples of communities who are working in partnership with organizations like grassroots organizations. Like if you have a watch, or there are sensors inside of your clothing that you can wear, for example, to predict how hot it's going to be in a community, right? And how do you start to prepare for that type of heat, particularly if you're in an agrarian society or landscape where you're growing food, and that type of heat index could damage your crops or the food that you're producing for those communities, right? So using those types of sensors so that communities collect their own data, they own their own data, and they can action on that data. There was an example somewhere overseas where they were using this type of technology, and because of what the models were predicting in terms of heat index, it didn't make sense for them to plant those crops because they were going to lose a lot of money, and they ended up not planting them, and they were able to save so much money and then plant it at a different time so that the farmers were able to really reap the benefits of that. So there's so many different ways that we can leverage this technology for the benefit of the people who have consistently been harmed by the way that we're currently using it, like police monitoring.
Yeah. And I think what you said was so important. It's who owns the data.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Because if you own the data, then you can truly understand how that data is going to be used so that it's not manipulated in a way that will then not cause harm to that community. Right.
Yeah.
Whereas so many, I don't want to say larger companies, but there are some companies that are out there where they'll give you the technology, but then they own the data.
That's right. That's
and
right.
they then share what they feel you need to know, right? Which may cause harm, not probably in the short term, but in the long term.
Absolutely.
Right. And so that's how
and that's currently happening now, Sasha. Like there are lots of organizations who come in and they're like, we want to help. So there's a savior complex already coming in saying, we know what's best for you.
Yeah.
We're going to come in and tell you what's best for you. Use our technology. We're going to extract your data. We are going to sell that data, and we're going to leverage that data for the benefit of our company and our organization to make money, and extracting your labor and your data in order to do that. That is what has happened historically. That is what is currently happening, particularly to impoverished Black, brown, poor, global South communities, which is why we're having so many conversations about environmental racism and climate injustices, because communities don't have any agency or ownership over their own resources, over their own labor, over their own data. And that needs to end. Like, we need to start leveraging this technology so that we are at the forefront of the conversations happening in our communities.
Yeah. And where my mind is going with this. So again, there are a handful of big tech companies that own a lot of this technology, right? But then I think of like my family's from the Caribbean, right? CARICOM. There's lots of conversation right now about climate change and what's happening and how it's impacting those areas now, right? And who is responsible for that are these first world countries with all of this technology. And so how they can leverage, but then I'm also seeing this lack of interest in these organizations and these companies providing these tools and resources to these governments and to these organizations that are there on the ground that can actually do something with it. And so it's this battle, and it's very frustrating to see, because then I talk to people that are there. Like, I know someone that is very connected with small businesses in the tech space in the Caribbean, and it's like, we have the talent, right? We have the talent. It's just access to the technology. And so what are some of the things that we need to consider, not necessarily organizations, but individuals that are passionate about this work, or just now hearing about this for the first time and want to hear more? Like, what are some things that we can do, or at least start thinking about, as we're seeing this connection between technology and creating more equitable spaces?
That's such a great question. I think there's so much happening right now, and it's happening at an unprecedented rate that we've ever seen in the history of like human existence. Mm-hmm. And I think that in order for us to like get on the train that's already moving, first, just find a way, like find an on-ramp to get in the conversation. If ChatGPT is your way to I'll take that back, Sasha. There is a Black woman who has created this tool called ChatGPT Black.
Oh, I heard about that. Okay.
Oh, listen, I was going to say ChatGPT, but scratch that. Go to ChatGPT Black, right? If that is your on-ramp to learning more about how predictive analysis works, I think you should utilize that tool that she's creating. Like, she's active on LinkedIn. So if any of our followers or listeners are active on LinkedIn, I highly suggest you follow that page. But if that's your on-ramp to understanding and learning more and interacting and engaging with that technology, I definitely suggest you start with something you are most familiar with. A lot of us already enact and engage with this type of technology. We just don't realize that's what it is. Yeah. Any type of website that has any type of chat feature or chat function is using AI technology. If you're using recipes that are predicting things that are in your fridge that you can create meals from for your family, that is a form of AI. So there are so many ways that we are already using the technology. We just don't realize it, right? So the first thing is to start with what you already know. The second thing is to build upon the knowledge, particularly for anyone who's looking to incorporate technology into their business. I would suggest you start following people who are already talking about this. There are a couple of Black women that I follow. Ruha Benjamin is a really big leader in this space. She talks a lot about how do we grow the world we want through technology. She has a book on that called, she's the author of Viral Justice, and she's a professor of African Studies. So I think like figuring out who's already talking about it in the space where your business resides, right? And how do you start to connect with those people? And then the third layer, once you're like, you've got that on wrap, you're following people who are talking about it. The third space is how do you start to connect what you're learning with how you want to implement it either in your work or in your communities, right? Yeah. So for me, my space is climate justice. I want to understand the intersection between climate justice and eliminating racism. And so my role or my goal is to learn as much as I can about this new and unprecedented emerging technology without being an actual, like I'm not an AI or machinist, right? I'm not that. But how do I connect with more people who do that work so I can understand how the technology works so that I can continue to talk to government leaders and officials and business leaders on how do they come alongside communities, giving them self-reliance and agency to access, leverage, and control their own data to solve the problems that other people have created. So yeah, those are the three things that I would say to start with.
You just said something that was just like, if I had a bell or a pom-pom, I was like, yes, because, you know, and it's more than just access. It is about the agency piece of it as well, too. It's, yes, let's give access, but then the agency to be able to do and control what we want to do with that in a way that we want to do that. And it's not controlled by anyone else or anyone else's mission or their bottom line.
That's correct. Right? Yep.
And I think that is so important in this. You know, one of the things that I'm really thinking about is there's so much in this emerging technology space that it can be very overwhelming. So I appreciate you saying, you know, kind of start with what you're already using. And AI is just, it's everywhere. Like I said, I was having these conversations 5 years ago. And then now, like everyone has access to it, and it's shifting how we're even thinking about the workplace. And so if it's impacting the workplace in the ways that it is, and, you know, people are feeling threatened, their jobs being threatened by AI, just imagine the impact or what it could do if put into the hands of someone that can really create impact and change in their communities.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely. Yep. So a couple of things come to mind when we're thinking about like people thinking about their jobs being impacted, which I am not going to stand in front of people and say that is not going to happen. It is absolutely going to happen, and it's coming, right? Yeah. For certain industries.
It's here for so many people.
Yes. Mm-hmm. For so many people, it is here. You're absolutely right. And then there are ways that we're not even thinking about leveraging technology for current roles as opposed to eliminating them. But anyway, there is a like really tangible thing that's currently happening. So think about last year, the president signed a $42 billion bill to support infrastructure for 8.5 million Americans to have the ability to access broadband. Now, if we're thinking about the fact that there are 8.5 million Americans who still do not have access to broadband technology, and now we are talking about digital currency, we're talking about AI and machine learning, we're talking about blockchain technology, and we still have so many people who don't have access to broadband, right? Broadband started and replaced dial-up in the early 2000s, right? Mm-hmm. Half of all the internet users had a broadband connection by 2007. And we're saying by 2030, that's when we're going to give the rest of the country access to broadband. Yeah. Like, we are so far behind. It's not even funny. So how do we start really small? So let's go back to the example of, let's say they have a chef. We have a lot of people in our communities who are like our grandmothers used to cook the best food we've ever had. And they're like, right? Like, I remember with my grandma, we used to pick the pecans from the trees, and she would make this pecan pie, and we would share it with the neighbor. I remember these things, right? These things build community. So how do we take people who are doing that, who are building culinary congruent foods, are creating foods in the community that connect people, and use AI to be able to expand that business? Like, how do we start to think of it in very, very, very tangible, small terms like that, right? So how do we leverage those types of technologies to do that kind of work? There's also opportunity for like construction workers. So how do we leverage tools like AI or blockchain technology to help us decide, where do we need to be building? Where's the next plot of land that we need to buy? Where is the building going in the future? There are builders right now who are using 3D technology to print homes.
Yeah.
Instead of labor, like actually physically building it, you can print homes, and it's a machine that you can buy. They're doing it already in Europe.
Like a printer. Yep.
Yes. Like, seriously, right? So there are things that we can, and it's not that these, like, the knowledge is so inaccessible. It's not that we don't have the resources to be able to buy those tools and machines.
Right.
It's that the knowledge is so inaccessible that so much of our community aren't even aware that these things exist, that by the time we find out, it's too far gone. The market is already saturated. So what I want to do is, like, how do we bring these things to us now so we can start to leverage them in the now, so that our communities can benefit from it? Because that's where they're building. That's where the land is the cheapest. And that's how we're being displaced.
When you were talking just now about just kind of construction and utilizing AI and machine, this technology, I'm just saying, I couldn't even put it in the bucket of AI, using technology for the future. One of the things that kind of came to mind, which is another layer of being mindful of communities, right? One of the things, especially in the African-American community, has been, there have been so many buildings built on top of graveyards.
Absolutely.
Right. And so it's like, how do you, one, understand the land that is there, like what was the previous, and you can do carbon dating and all of that, you know, all based in technology, but then also based on what you know about this soil or this community and the environment, what's the best type of home that would be sustainable in this space?
Or even, should you even build on top of that kind of land at all, right?
Right.
And this all comes from ownership.
Exactly. So it's like there's so many layers of information that can be placed in this, right? Where it may provide a space where, like, okay, there's a courtyard in the middle of this community, right? That's honoring those that have gone before us, right? But then the homes are built in a certain way where they're honoring the environment and the earth and not going to cause additional erosion. And, you know, so it's like, I'm looking at this from so many different perspectives, and the thoughtfulness that is required often gets superseded by capitalism.
Every day of the week. I keep trying to think about, like, how do we start to think of the earth as a stakeholder? I don't know, Sacha, but like in my brain, I was like, in all the things that we are looking to do now and into the future, how do we start to bring the earth in as a stakeholder, right? So to your point that you were making about building on top of like desecrating land where our ancestors have been buried, how do we start to first identify where those pieces of land are? Where do they exist? We don't even know. Blockchain technology is actually an emerging tech that can help with that. And it helps you, first of all, create like land deeds that are uneditable. I wish I can go much more deep into blockchain, but I love blockchain technology for this, right? It's transparent, which means that everyone has access to it. It's a public domain. And then once multiple hundreds of thousands of people have agreed that this is the deed, it is inalterable. You cannot alter it until someone else makes a change, and then another 100,000 people come in and validate that. So I think that's another way, right? So how do we first identify the land? How do we lock in the land to who owns it? Well, first of all, land, that's a whole different conversation. I'm not even gonna go. Right. I'm not even gonna go to like owning land, but that's a whole different thing, right? So how do we start to take care of the earth? How do we use the technology that we have to identify where these parcels of land are? And then how do we start to think differently about building sustainable communities where they're community self-reliant, which means the community itself is the hub that is taking care of itself. There's this thing in Austin, and I think Baltimore actually pioneered it. It's called resiliency hubs. And basically what they're doing is they started it during COVID, where the federal government was giving all of these COVID funds to communities. And so what Baltimore and the city of Austin did was they created this pot of money. And they identified community resources and community stakeholders like churches and grassroots organizations. And they were just a funnel for those resources, right? And what ended up happening was those now community organizations become the hub in a community. So let's say there's a flood or there's a natural disaster where people need access to food, they need access to electricity for refrigeration for their oxygen tank or their medication or their baby formula, right? They could go to these hubs that are within 1 mile of their home and get access to that during those emergencies. So there are a multitude of ways that we can give communities agency. Number one, by giving them the resources. Right? Yeah. We don't need to decide what needs to be done with them. The community knows what they need. You give them the resources and tools to be able to have the agency to say, we have the resources. This is what we have decided to do for the benefit of us and the people who live here. So there's so many examples of small examples. I wish they were larger, right? Of where this is happening. And we should be able to scale this in other places.
And that's the key, right? A lot of this stuff is already happening grassroots. A lot of the organizations that are trying to tap into this technology, be it, whatever aspect of technology that it is, are grassroots or smaller organizations that just need, like you're saying, the resources to be able to scale.
And unrestricted resources. Unrestricted resources.
And I was just going to say, I have a conspiracy theory around that, around, the folks that can do unrestricted want to restrict because they don't want to then be put out of their position of power. But that's a whole other conversation.
Right, it is. We can talk about that the rest of the show and not have enough time.
That's a whole other conversation. So Skyra, I'm going to do a little bit of a pivot.
Okay.
Because, I can tell just talking to you, like this is something that you are truly passionate about, very knowledgeable about. And it touches home, right? Like in some ways and aspects, it really touches home. So what are the things that you do to take care of yourself as you're doing this work?
That's such a good question, Sasha. So,
and you knew it was coming. You knew it was coming.
Listen. Okay. So, one of the big things that I have recently started doing is I am very much invested in my mental health and healing journey. I have a Black woman therapist who is, if she ever leaves me, child, I don't know what I would do. I love her. We meet twice a month. And like that has been the biggest and best and most impactful investment I've ever made in my entire life for the past 3 years. Every 2 weeks for the past 3 years, I have been meeting with her. And this is an opportunity for me to uproot and uncover and dig out all of the stuff that white supremacy has taught me to believe about myself, about people who look like me, about people who look like me in other parts of the world, the entire diaspora, and really root that out and replace it with something else. Something that's healing, something that's liberating, something that brings freedom to myself and to others that I come into contact with. So that has been a big journey for me. The other thing is that I constantly remind myself, and we were talking about sticky notes earlier. I have sticky notes all over. One of them says, I'm building the world that I needed.
Hold on, mine. Failure is not an option.
Listen, so like
it's right there on my desk.
Every time I feel like I get stuck or I get frustrated, or I'm like, I'm done. I don't want to do this. It's too hard. It's going to take too long. I don't have it in me. I remind myself, I'm building the world that I needed. I am building the world that I needed. And I want to have that world now. Like a lot of people ask the question, Skyra, why do you do this work? And people are like, I do it for future generations. I do it for my kids. Love my son, love him to death. Okay, I do this work for me. I do this work to liberate me. I want to live in a free world where I can exist in this body, in this space, with this name, with this face, with this background, and be free from oppression and racism and white supremacy. Like I do it for me now. And then the last thing is I constantly ask myself the question, does this space deserve me?
That part.
And if the answer is no, then I go to the spaces that do.
That is so powerful because I think, one of the questions my coach um, asked me, and I've said this a million times, and even when she was on the show, I shared it, right? It's like, where do you have the greatest impact, inside or outside of the organization? And I constantly ask myself that in a similar way, like, do I have impact here? And if I feel like I'm not going to make an impact, or it's going to be a whole lot more energy than it needs to be,
Yep.
and it's still going to be a small amount, like, can I take my energy, efforts, talents elsewhere and have a greater impact in that space?
Yep.
And so I think it helps with that mental health a lot as well too, because you're not spinning your wheels trying to figure out, oh, why is it this not working, and oh, it must be me. No, they're not ready for you.
They're not. Come on, Moses. They're not ready for you.
They're
They're
not
not
ready.
ready for you. And sometimes you are the seed planter. You're not the waterer, right?
Right.
Someone else needs to come in and do the rest of the work. You are there to do a part of it. And we need
Yeah.
to remind ourselves of that. Like, as much as we talk about colonizers being saviors, sometimes we are too. We're not here to do every
Listen.
single part of the work. We're here to do a certain part of the work. Someone else is here to do the rest.
Yeah. That is so beautiful. All right, Skyra, if folks wanted to get in contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, SkyraRideaux.com. A lot of information and resources there for you. Also, you can follow me on LinkedIn. It's linkedin.com/Skyra Rideaux. Or also feel free to email me, Skyra@SkyraRideaux.com.
Wonderful. Skyra, thank you so much for this. Like, we could have gone on and on and on and on and on. But I'm so glad we at least started this conversation, because I think with everything that is going on with technology right now, and people having access to it, right? No understanding and knowing that there are gaps in that access. And I think it's so important that if we are working in this DEI space and we're talking about equity and we're talking about everyone feeling valued and seen and heard and connected, that we're doing the things that we need to do for people to feel those connection points. So thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for joining me today. And everyone, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of DEI After 5. I hope you were able to walk away with some new information or a few nuggets that you didn't have when the show started. As always, you can find us here every Tuesday at 5:15 Eastern on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast, on your favorite platforms. And until next time, have a good one.